Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present LChayim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and throughout the Jewish community in America, there are many wonderful Jewish leaders, men and women, rabbis, and I hear more and more from people like you who write me all the time, who speak to me, that they feel so lucky to have their rabbi in their congregation, in their community. It's not only rabbis, it's cantors and educators, Federation execs, and other Jewish professionals who serve the Jewish community. So many wonderful people are helping to guide and shape Jewish life on the local level. And at the same time, there are also men and women who are making enormous contributions to Jewish life on a larger scale. Brilliant, dynamic, charismatic individuals of unusual intellect and imagination and soul, who are helping the entire community better understand and embrace Jewish life today. And on this edition of LChayim, I am honored to present to you an individual who is making an extraordinary contribution to Jewish life throughout America. Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer currently serves the Jewish world as the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. And if you're a regular viewer of Shalom TV, you've seen Yehuda Kurtzer many times in programs that he's participated in, which we've shown you on Shalom TV. But if you're meeting him for the first time, you should know that Yehuda Kurtzer has a doctorate from Harvard in Jewish Studies and served as chair of Jewish Communal Innovation at Brandeis University. He's written a book with the most intriguing title, Shuvah, the Future of the Jewish Past. And Yehuda Kurtzer is quite simply recognized as one of the most creative Jewish leaders on the world Jewish scene today. And I'm especially pleased to have him at this table. And Yehuda Kurtzer, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Mark. That was a gracious introduction.
Well, you are extraordinary, and we've been in each other's presence a number of times. And what you're doing on the Jewish scene, Yehuda, is just Yotzei min haklal. It's outstanding, and I want to talk to you about you and what you're doing. May I first talk about you?
Wonderful.
Okay. Yeah. So, you know, whenever anybody reads your bio, the first thing that jumps out at them is that you are the son of Daniel Kurtzer, who was an American ambassador both to Egypt, but more importantly for us, to the state of Israel. And then I read that, lo and behold, you grew up in Egypt and in Tel Aviv. Yeah. And I also note that you were in Cairo when Anwar Sadat was assassinated. But I assume you were very, very young at that time.
I was.
Okay. But do any of those memories stay with you, what it was like to be, first of all, the son of a traveling diplomat on the American scene? And I imagine in some way that has shaped who you became. So how would you talk about that?
Absolutely, it's shaped who I've become. I think I'm enormously proud of my dad as not only an American leader, an important public figure, and a public servant, but also as a Jew. He served in the Middle East at a time as a Jew, openly as a Jew, as a modern Orthodox Jew, even though he was told early in his career in the State Department that his Jewish identity would prohibit him from serving in the Arab world. And to be able to then go at the tail end of his career in the Foreign Service as the first openly Jewish ambassador to the Arab world, and then serve in the State of Israel on behalf of the U.S. government with a kosher embassy was an extraordinary accomplishment. And they let him do this? No, they let him do it, but he was the obvious person to do it. He had emerged as not only a great Foreign Service officer for the U.S., not only deeply passionate about the peace process and the U.S. relationship in the Arab world, but also as a person of profound integrity, for whom his Jewishness was a deep feature of his identity, and he was unapologetic about it, and it guided his values, but not in any way that would distract him from his responsibilities to the U.S.
Take me back one step.
Sure.
Who were his parents?
My grandparents, Nate and Sylvia Kurtzer. All four of my grandparents were born in America, so I'm fourth generation American. My grandfather, Nate, was the oldest of 6 siblings and was in that generation of that really responsible for helping to raise his other younger siblings. A really proud New Jerseyan. They lived in Elizabeth, New Jersey for a long time. Made a commitment when my dad was around bar mitzvah age that he wanted to start becoming Shomer Shabbat, becoming
not
observant.
Till then.
Had not been until then. Changed over the dynamic in their household.
Did he ever tell you why?
You know, I'm sure my dad knows why.
Okay.
But I think actually it may have had to do with the fact that he had 2 daughters and then a son who was becoming bar mitzvah, and maybe something rattled around about taking responsibility for authentic Jewish choices at that coming of age. And owned a small business in New Jersey, very Jewishly proud, but in some ways blue collar. And it was a real shift in direction for my father to say, you know, I don't want to be in the family business, and I want to pursue this dream of. I think for my father, the turning point, as for many in his generation, was the 6-Day War. He was 18 when the 6-Day War hit. He spent the summer of 1967 after the war in Jerusalem cleaning up at Hebrew University.
Wow.
And I think something clicked for him at that formative time in his life.
And
this is what I want to work on.
Fabulous. From his 13th birthday on, as his father sort of embraced more of Jewish tradition as he became a bar mitzvah, that's the household he grew up in.
Yeah, that's right.
And then when he creates his own home, he already is modern Orthodox?
Yep. And that's the household I was raised in.
Okay. And do you have siblings?
I have 2 brothers, an older brother and a younger brother.
Do they all embrace Judaism now?
They do in all of our different ways. I think, you know, one of the big lessons that came out of the household in which I grew up, in which my parents had very explicit choices on kashrut and keeping Shabbat, being part of an observant community. But at the same time, our Shabbat table was one of the most pluralistic and intellectually exciting places you can imagine. Well, my dad would travel and work on the peace process, and every Shabbat guest wanted to talk about that. And it also meant that you had all of these folks involved in this work coming over on Shabbat, being part of our Shabbat table. And I think that those were 2 different lessons that were coming from my parents. One was to make sincere Jewish choices and make authentic Jewish choices on one hand, and on the other hand, a kind of radical openness to ideas and to human beings and to people of all different types. And so my brothers, I think, in their own ways have done that. My older brother was briefly in the Foreign Service and is now a lawyer in Washington. Has a lot of very affirmative Jewish choices in their home, and also a lot of very idiosyncratic choices, and intellectually one of the most open, pluralistic thinkers I know. And my younger brother works for the International Red Cross on refugee issues. He also internalized the public service commitment that came from my father, and also has a kind of totally idiosyncratic sensibility about his Jewish choices, but cares about Jewish ideas in a deep way. And so all of us kind of took little pieces.
That's so lovely. Yehuda, when one imagines a father who is involved in such large-scale work, there's a danger that he didn't have time for his children or his family. To what extent was he present for you?
Yeah, that wasn't really the issue. You know, little things matter when my wife and I have 3 little children now, and we have jobs that require a lot of travel and a focus outward. And you make little choices that you hope signal the core and the nature of your commitment about what it is to be with your children who are actually there. A commitment to what it means to create a Shabbat atmosphere in your home that is the most valued family time. And I think also knowing and caring about your children's core commitments. And not, as a parent, you don't affirm every choice that your children makes, but you want to know who they are as people in order to guide them. And my dad, to his enormous credit, has always been just extremely thoughtful about not the objective set of choices I should make, but who am I as a person and what choices should I make, and how he could be a mentor, guide through that.
That's lovely. You were very lucky.
Yeah.
What's your mother like? Who's your mother?
My mother,
named
Sheila Kurtzer, Sheila Doppelt Kurtzer, raised in Flatbush, and part of really a kind of Jewish leadership family on the lay side. My grandfather, Zichrono Livracha, Jacob Doppelt, was part of a founding group that created the Yeshiva of Flatbush. and very kind of impactful in the 1950s in Brooklyn. You know, my parents really built a team together, especially when they went overseas, when my father was the ambassador from 1998 to 2005. My father's strongest instincts are on the policy side. He is, by his own admission, a little bit more of a wallflower. He's very happy to sit in the back of shul. And my mother is responsible for the social atmosphere of our household. And when you're serving as an ambassador, the social dimensions of the work are critical. Do people feel that not only are you a person they want to talk to, but are you a convener of a serious conversation? And my mom and my dad really teamed up in those 7 years and did enormous work in American public diplomacy on the social sense, both in Egypt and in Israel. And these are contentious times, right? They were in Egypt from 1998 through right before 9/11. They were in Israel through the Second Intifada. These were times when the America-Israel relationship and the America-Egypt relationship were evolving considerably. And to have the kind of public diplomats who they were really required that teamwork from my mom and my dad.
Mm-hmm. So come back now to just what it was like for you. You ultimately go to school in Israel. You learn Hebrew as a young person, correct?
Yeah, well, my parents' first tour of duty in Israel was when I was between grade 1 and grade 4. So I went to a Israeli religious public school for 3 years, and then an American school for the 4th year because I had to come back to the States and I didn't know English.
Yes, okay. Fascinating, fascinating. Yeah. You're very bright. My guess is you are an unusual child as well as an unusual adult. So that the average child may not have been as aware as you were aware. At the same time, you were still a child.
I was a kid. Yeah.
So the extent to you can sort of put this in perspective for us, how much were you aware of the larger Israeli scene when you were there?
Not at all.
Not at all.
And I think, and to the credit of my parents, they created home. And so home had dynamics that were different than ultimately it became clear when we moved to Washington, D.C. Oh, wait, home is different. They did little things like taking us on tiyulim around Israel, and when we were living in Egypt, driving to Israel for Pesach. They did little things like that, but they very much cultivated a home atmosphere in these places that could have been replicated anywhere else in the world.
Okay, very lovely. Okay. Do you think, however, the experience of being a diplomat's child shaped the extent to which you are conscious of and involved in issues that have to do with Israeli-American relationship and, in general, the way in which the Jewish community interacts with the entire world?
Yeah, and it's very direct. I knew as a result of my upbringing that I didn't want to follow my father's exact footsteps into the Foreign Service. It creates a lot of disruptions, and in the life that we lead as traditional Jews, we are very committed to the communities in which we lived, and so the idea that we would pick up and move from place to place was not something that we wanted to do. But I think the lessons of global responsibility, of really excavating who you are as a Jew and therefore turning that into your life's mission. They resonated with me, with my brothers, and also just the richness of conversation when you're actually talking about stuff that's important, and not allowing that your fun conversations are the ones that are frivolous and the serious conversations are important but not fun. But actually being able to bridge those was really it was Friday night dinner. And so this was very deep. And I also felt reflecting on this after my upbringing, living on this threshold between being kind of a member of the Jewish people with one foot and a member of the human race on the other. And with this connection to Israel that was very deep, but also we were visitors. Those tensions have been really important to me in my life, and they actually have, I feel, very explicitly translated into working now as the American head of an Israeli institution, where I feel the benefit of these two identities, but also a clear cognition that these are not the same. They're not the same identities, and they shouldn't be blurred.
Mm-hmm. Just to finish this chapter, what's your father doing now?
My father left the Foreign Service in 2005 and was offered a phenomenal position as the Danny Abraham Chair of Middle East Studies, I think that's the title, at Princeton in the Woodrow Wilson School, which affords him an opportunity both to teach undergraduates and graduate students. He brings seminars of his students to Israel and gives them the best Israel trip you could imagine. Also has given him a platform to do a lot more public writing. He's put out several books. And I think is really enjoying the ability to be an influential policy thinker without the kind of drag of actually doing policy.
Well, good for him, and I hope I get to meet him one day. He sounds very, very special.
It's remarkable.
In terms of your own Jewish journey, you were brought up in what you call a modern Orthodox home.
Yeah.
Have you moved, or are you still there? Do you consider yourself still modern Orthodox, or do you self-define in a different way?
You know, maybe it'll answer the question by saying that I don't love the categories. Look, I'm never sure to what extent I've moved and to what extent these categories have moved. And I think that any observer of modern Orthodoxy will say that there's been a shift in the world of Orthodoxy over the past 20 years, that some of the same people with some of the same values are not quite aligned as they were with the categories in which they once lived. I moved from Israel into a modern Orthodox yeshiva day school in Washington, and that's where I went through elementary and high school. I spent 2 years in a yeshiva in Israel at Gush Etzion. I don't think I've ever made any radically opposite choices to the values in which I was raised, with the one exception that it's become very important in our household to not only belong to egalitarian settings, but to make egalitarianism a normative value in our household. It's how we want to live our marriage and so on. So,
in a way that is not representative of modern Orthodoxy?
In a way that's not consistent with how modern Orthodoxy is today.
But something allowed you to do that, or prompted you to do that, because that is, even though it's interesting, there is within modern Orthodoxy a tremendous effort to bridge the gap and to embrace egalitarianism, but it hasn't yet happened, and it has for you. So what pushed you to that point?
My wife and I were
Your wife
initially
is
in Boston.
Stephanie.
Stephanie Ives. My wife and I lived in Boston for 10 years, but we had a 1 year in the interim where we were in D.C. because she had a clerkship. And we found ourselves pulled into a new congregation called the D.C. Minyan, which was an effort to create compromise in a community that wasn't really walking distance, either to the conservative synagogue or the Orthodox one, between folks who wanted to create community together and do so in ways that could help cross some of those boundaries. Really serious about prayer, really serious about study and learning, wanted to create a normatively observant community, but negotiated issues of egalitarianism. I think the boundary crossing that made it possible for us to move in this direction was, and this is not uncommon, through socialization. If you see that you don't have to give up the ship in order to actually embrace your values, it makes it much easier. And then when we moved to Boston and we created our own egalitarian community, what made it a remarkable little community was that it was a predominantly observant, Shabbat observant, kosher keeping community with a lot of folks who had grown up Orthodox who felt compelled by the kind of ethical story of what egalitarianism represented, but didn't want to trade the kind of normative experience of living in a traditional community. And it's very hard to find out there, except in rarefied places, conservative congregations in which you're able to preserve a critical mass of an observant population that's both passionate about this set of values and that set of values. So I think it was that social experience largely that enabled us to say, hey, there's a community around us that wants to live at this threshold.
You said a moment ago, you want to try to get away from labels, and I understand that. And as I watch the evolution of the American Jewish community, the lines that are that once separated, Orthodox, conservative, Reform, where did the Reconstructionists fit in, are far less definite. At the same time, there are things that represent Orthodoxy, which are not typical of a mainstream conservative synagogue. And one of the things I was wondering as I understand who you are is why you would not say that you are very comfortable with, if you had to label yourself, conservative Judaism on the more observant end of the spectrum. You're not the only person who would say, I want to be a conservative Jew, but I want to live a mainstream halachic lifestyle. And so is there a reason why you would not say that you are now more comfortable within the Orthodox movement than within the Orthodox movement? Is there a difference anymore between a Jew who is serious about living an observant life, but not necessarily in a strictly Orthodox way, and even in Reform Judaism, there are some Jews who are very committed to Jewish observance. Yes, they're less obvious, it happens less often, but today one can be a Jew who embraces Jewish tradition almost in any communal setting. So how do you view that?
Look, first of all, I mean no disrespect to the conservative shul to which I belong and to the rabbi who I revere.
But who's the rabbi?
Barry Dovkatz.
Okay.
Really, one of the good guys. I guess for me, there's a larger critique of what I think is happening in the American Jewish community around these denominational labels, which is that the denominational labels worked for a long time on the proposition that the denomination reflects not a range of choices, but a set of fixed choices that must travel together. And when you align those, that's why you create superstructures like the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism or like the Central Conference of American Rabbis, that you essentially require people implicitly to sign on a dotted line of a set of belongings. If I'm going to send my kids to camp, it'll be through this movement. If my kids are going to be in a youth movement here, when I grow older, I'm going to be in the men's club, right? Whatever it is, you're belonging to a set of fixed institutions, and with that come committees of ideology. Right? If you're in this movement, this is the committee that's navigating the ideology of this movement. I don't think that tells an accurate story anymore of who American Jews are and where they're going. And it's not surprising that a lot of umbrella-like organizations are therefore being challenged to rethink, if we're not offering value to people beyond their local institutional affiliations, what are we about? I think that's an unbelievably important institutional Jewish conversation. I guess what I'm trying to reserve the right for myself to be what I think Jewishness always wanted us to be, which is autonomous thinkers who function in community. And sometimes what these labels do is they actually free you from the kind of thinking that I think you have to do as a Jew about, do I accept this piece of the rules or do I not? Not that we are supposed to be challenging authority at every turn, but I think we're supposed to be thoughtful about our decisions. When we started our minyan in Brookline, for me, I think there were other people who had different motivations for this. One of the reasons it was important to me that we had separate seating, no mechitza down the middle, and a fully egalitarian prayer service was that what we were implicitly doing was educating that those three issues, how you sit, whether there's a separation, and who participates, are three different issues. And when you call yourself a denominational label, what you're saying to people is package together your choices, and that's an ideology. I guess that's my bias, is to say we actually have to educate towards complex choices rather than reductive ones. And that's part of why I'm skittish about the label.
But I am very impressed with the way you say it, and I think you're 100% correct. And in essence, the labels mean less and less to you and have less and less meaning to American Jews, don't you feel?
I think so, and it's destructive because, look, we belong to a conservative synagogue. Our kids are in an Orthodox day school. Our friends are all over the map. What I want my kids to learn is, what are the values that are important to my parents and to being Jewish? And conservative Judaism is not a value. It's a collection of practices and beliefs. The values are halacha. The values are community. The values are egalitarianism. Those then will navigate as we evolve, as we learn, what's the constellation of how I build together those values to assemble a meaningful Jewish life. So sometimes actually those labels not only are they not that useful, but they're actually destructive to the type of choice-type conversations that we should be cultivating in Jewish life.
You know, Yehuda, as we talk, I'm thinking to myself of the people who are watching us, and people are watching us all over America, Jew and non-Jew. And I want them to be able to take away from what you're saying something that can help them in their own decisions. in part, people find a place in a synagogue in which they're comfortable. I think many of us make decisions. Everybody makes decisions of their own.
Yeah.
Everybody. We make decisions that, A, reflect where we've been, to a large extent, who our parents were in the home we were brought up in, and what we want to create for our children, and where we're most comfortable. And what I'm hoping that people hear from you is that you seem to be embracing the choices that people make, no matter where the choices are. And it's no longer about boxes. And if I'm going too far, you need to stop me. You're with the Shalom Hartman Institute. You're the president here in North America. You already said how pleased you are to be connected with an Israeli institution. But it really is based in Jerusalem, and it's speaking to the entire Jewish world. And it's speaking to the entire Jewish world about Jewish pluralism. And you have people who founded it, David Hartman and then his son Daniel, both of whom are committed enormously to Jewish tradition and to halakha. Yeah. I believe they're committed more to Jewish tradition than halakha, and that ultimately we all find the halakha that means something to us, Jewish law, or a Jewish way of living. But they embraced the idea of pluralism, and what you seem to be articulating in a marvelous way is an embrace of Jewish choice that allows people who are anywhere in the Jewish world to find their way to embrace for themselves and their families and their wives and their husbands and their children patterns of Jewish life that are meaning to them. And the question I wanted to address was, and that's why I say if I'm going too far, you stop me. To what extent are you comfortable with a Jew who says, Yehuda, I love the general focus that you describe. I make my own choice in a more limited way. I am not as halakhically observant as you are, and yet I feel passionate about my Jewish life, the Jewish home I'm creating, and the Judaism I want to bring to my children. To what extent do you validate those choices as well when they are not choices that you and Stephanie would make?
Look, first of all, personal choices that somebody make need no validation from me, right? That's the gift of America, right? And any Jewish institutional framework that is still thinking coercively about its membership has missed the boat on what America is, right? Anything we offer, any institution is going to be: are we speaking in a language that's compelling to people who are going to make choices to be part of us or not, right? And one way we talk about this at the Institute is, in America, all Jews are Jews by choice. It's not, here's the converts and here are the born Jews. We're all Jews by choice.
Why isn't that true all over the world?
Because this has been the best success story of the freedom of American Jews to work in this context. And it's a growing Jewish community, whereas in other parts of the world, where Jews are in a little bit more vulnerable positions in terms of their public identities, that hasn't been enabled quite the same way. Now, that said, I am a little bit of an elitist. That doesn't mean that I think my choices are better than others. What I do think is, for me, the extent to which I validate other choices are on the basis of, let's use the categories of thoughtfulness and authenticity. Meaning, somebody says, here's my reading of my upbringing, the tradition, the sources, what it means to be Jewish today. It makes learned choices and it comes out in a different place than me. Fantastic. Person who says, I need you to validate my choices, but I'm not investigating my choices in any sort of deep and meaningful way, I'm not inclined to validate that choice because it doesn't feel to me like a choice. It just feels like a little bit more of an opt-out. I have my own way in which I build and assemble my Jewish life, but in my job, our service is to the Jewish people, and one of our main educational clients are rabbis of congregations around the country. When conservative rabbis, Reform rabbis, Orthodox rabbis come study at the Hartman Institute, I am not trying to move them off of their ideological bent, nor am I trying to challenge their leadership in their community by trying to go around them to their congregants and tell them to disassemble their identities. What I am trying to say to them is, we're going to present Jewish ideas on the most central challenges facing the Jewish people. We're going to try to create the most rigorous Beit Midrash of Jewish texts and ideas that is both thoughtful about where Judaism is going and respectful of where Judaism has been. And I want you, a conservative rabbi or a Reform rabbi, to study this stuff, go home, and be the best rabbi to your congregants that you can be. Say something. Make sure you have something to say to your people. And what comes out of that is exactly the type of set of Jewish choices that I feel very comfortable validating. Right? And again, and here's one of the things that we do wrong, I think, in the Jewish community, is that we think that all validations have to be the same. Right? Am I allowed as a Jew to say, I take you totally seriously with all of your choices, and I still have a level of kashrut that doesn't allow me to eat in your home? Right? So let's figure out a way that we can break bread together that enables me to validate you without necessarily doing exactly what you do. That, to me, is a sophisticated pluralism conversation. And it's not the same as either demanding that everyone behave the same way as me, and it's not the same as validating everybody's choices and saying that they're all identical. It's a principled type of validation, and I think that's what I feel like I work towards.
Give me an example from your perspective. And you know, I said to myself, on any given day, the answer to my question could be different for you. It's what is on your mind today. Give me an example of a challenge that you think is confronting Jewish life in general. That when you say, you know, if I'm teaching at the Shalom Hartman Institute, I would love, whether it's rabbis, educators, or lay leaders, lay Jews, I would love them to be aware of the following issues and challenges to Jewish life. What are one or two of the ones that are on your mind these days?
Oh, I'll tell you a good one. The Israeli chief rabbinate recently ran up against the buzzsaw of some members of the American Jewish establishment in its attempt to invalidate the legitimate, Jewish stance of a particular American rabbi. Actually, lives pretty close to me.
You're talking about Avi Weiss.
Avi Weiss. And as of the news, right, the rabbinate capitulated and accepted Rabbi Weiss's halachic positions. To me, this is symptomatic of a much bigger question a much bigger conversation that be taking place in the Jewish world, which is not, is this individual rabbi legitimate or not legitimate vis-a-vis the chief rabbinate, but what is going to be the future of the relationship between a state of Israel in which you have official mechanisms of the state that are the arbiters of a type of Judaism, and an American Judaism that is increasingly diverse in its authentic choices about itself? This is not going to work long term, right? And to me, my unfiltered opinion is that the chief rabbinate dipped its toe in the water and said, let's try it. Let's try what happens when we push back against the American Jewish community, which does whatever it wants to do. In this case, the American Jewish community pushed back, but I think it portends a much bigger challenge. The question I think that I would love to curricularize about this is, what does this mean for the Jewish people today to have, and we talk about this a lot at Hartman, one massive Jewish experiment, which is Judaism under sovereignty, and the other massive Jewish experiment, which is Judaism outside of sovereignty, which has become a radically different laboratory for Jewish identity and expression. Now, on their own, those are really interesting topics to study. What happens at the bridge points? Because we American Jews, even if we bristle at the chief rabbinate, what we don't want to have happen is that these become ships in the night. That the chief rabbinate says, fine, we'll just deal internally with Israeli issues and we'll leave you American Jews there. We need an interdependency between these two places. It just can't work in the way that it's currently worked. That, to me, is a central Jewish question today that goes to the heart of not only what does it mean to be Jewish in America, what does it mean to be Jewish in Israel, but the relationship between these communities as it evolves.
How do you react when you hear American Jews say there should be no Israeli rabbinate of an official nature?
Yeah, I could get behind that. Look, I think
there are Israelis who are saying too.
Of course, I think that there is a role for a chief rabbinate in a Jewish state that is a little bit different than the way it currently functions. I don't think it needs to have coercive powers, and I don't think it should have any meaningful role in personal status issues for which the government already has a need to manage these issues in a way that's different than the religion does. I would love to see a move towards the Jewishness of the Jewish state around helping to shape the national character of the country. Right? Why can't the chief rabbi be, prophet in chief? Right? The kind of face of Judaism that's helping to shape public policy through diplomacy and negotiation, through ideas, through teaching. I could see a chief rabbinate that's pluralistic.
And not necessarily Orthodox?
And not necessarily Orthodox. Already we've built in a pluralism that you have an Ashkenazi chief rabbi and a Sephardic chief rabbi. Why can't you have a secular chief rabbi, right? Or a representative from the rest of the movement's chief rabbi?
I'm sorry, a secular chief rabbi? What do you have in mind? What is a secular chief rabbi?
It's a little bit of a game, because one of the things that has changed in Israel that American Jews haven't always caught up to is that it's no longer a country of a secular versus religious divide. There's so much textured Jewish identity in Israel, with a lot of people who will still refer to themselves as secular because they're trying to draw a distinction between themselves and the normative religious establishment, but who in that secularism are actually embodying a really complex Jewish identity. So when I use the phrase secular chief rabbi, what I'm referring to is this kind of tapestry of Jewish identity that again, like we talked about before, doesn't want to channel the organized terminology of Jewishness, but is actually playing in a sandbox of Jewishness in really rich ways. A colleague of mine in Jerusalem created a Friday night Kabbalat Shabbat service on the port of Tel Aviv. And in the summer, he gets 1,000 people. Now, he's drawing on a religious experience. It is not religious by like an Orthodox Jewish standard, but it is a deep engagement with Jewish tradition in a way that works for a sovereign Israeli space and for Israeli secularism. That voice is just becoming more and more powerful in Israel. I don't know that they want a chief rabbi, but it's a way of saying, I love the role of the chief rabbi to be the inspired type of teachers who help Israel attain its aspirational Jewish character. And right now, it feels that it feels like it has resorted to being a bureaucratic office in a way that not only is bad for the state and its policies, but it feels like a debasement of Judaism.
If you could shape Israeli policy, would you want the state of Israel to validate weddings performed by non-Orthodox rabbis?
Sure.
Okay. Would you want it to accept different forms of conversion ceremonies here in the diaspora?
Yes.
And where does that stand in your mind? I mean, isn't that sort of at the moment quixotic on your part? It seems like we're so far from that.
So what's funny about this issue is that there's already a gap between the formal policies of the State of Israel with respect to immigration,
yes,
and the formal policies of the State of Israel with respect to religious ritual as mediated by the Ministry of Religion. The formal rules, the State of Israel already let the cat out of the bag by using an adapted version of the Nuremberg laws as the means of attaining Israeli citizenship.
Meaning?
You need one grandparent to be Jewish in order to become a citizen of the State of Israel. Now, what they were not doing was acceding to patrilineal descent. They were not making an argument about conversion. What they were basically saying was, and there's very important historical reasons why, if you were Jewish enough in Europe to be killed by Hitler, you're Jewish enough to be a member of the Jewish people for the purpose of Jewish national identity. So the State of Israel has already introduced that there can be different variables when it comes to Jewish identity with respect to the State of Israel. The rabbinate has taken a very hard line with respect to the little fiefdom that it controls, which is matters of personal status, in which it has embraced only an Orthodox Jewish ethos, although the Supreme Court forced them to accept the marriages and conversions from U.S. and Cyprus, so that somebody who comes in as a Jew. So it's already happening. Part of, you call it quixotic, I just say it's a reality check. This is already the plan. This is already what we're doing. And it's just about normalizing, validating, and being explicit about the fact that the State of Israel can accept these behaviors and these types of entrance into the Jewish people without forfeiting the seriousness with which it takes a Jewish identity. It just has to be serious on both fronts.
Mm-hmm. My understanding is that there's a distinction made in Israel between who can return to Israel, who can become a citizen under the law of return, and who has an easy time marrying in the State of Israel. And that at the moment, if you are converted anywhere in the world,
yes,
your conversion is accepted by the State of Israel for right of return.
That's right.
That doesn't mean that when you want to marry another Jew in Israel, you'll find a rabbi who can do it. And I don't understand whether you are conflating those two as you describe this.
What I'm saying is there's no logic to keeping them.
No, there's no logic.
To keeping them the way they are. Right. It's an embarrassment to Judaism, because what happens is somebody is Jewish enough to become a citizen of the state of Israel, but the rabbis who represent the state of Israel then say to them, but you're not Jewish enough to get married. And so what does a person then do? They get married.
Of course.
It's not that somebody doesn't get married, but now their impression is Judaism thinks this of me. Why are we doing that? Now, what's so bizarre about it is that I think their theory, which has been proven wrong, is that if we take a hard stance on this, we will be immune from the problems that emerge of non-serious Jews playing with us. But the list, and on the technical level, it's about mamzerim, bastard children. Right? If you have an invalid wedding and then an invalid divorce, or if you have a valid wedding and an invalid divorce, and then you marry somebody else, then your children are illegitimate. You think
the children come from the second
second marriage
right.
being
because you basically, it's the woman really. The woman is guilty of adultery, and an adulterous woman produces a mamzer, an illegitimate child.
Does anybody in this world think that that's not already happening? So instead what happens is it doesn't run through the pipeline of the rabbinate. They can wash their hands of it. They've now made Judaism look terrible to this family, and they have no information anymore about who the people are in the state of Israel.
Okay.
They haven't fixed the problem.
You're absolutely
They've just
right.
cleansed themselves of it.
And what is the extension of your logic for Jews in America? And what I mean by that is, if somebody argued to you that rabbis in America should be willing to stand at a chuppah as a Masader Kedushin, as somebody who is making sure the wedding takes place, where one of the people is not Jewish, A, they're going to do it anyway. B, very often they will create a Jewish home. And that in part, if one grandparent, it's not a matter whether one grandparent is Jewish or patrilineal descent, but the reality is that if a Jew and a non-Jew marry, and they create a Jewish home, and they bring children up with this Jewish sense of identity, and that child one day is in a synagogue which accepts him as a Jew or her as a Jew, and he has a bar mitzvah, a bat mitzvah ceremony, and one day this Jew wants to get married here in America. Most American rabbis, certainly not who are non-Orthodox, are going to marry that Jew, and next thing you know, they move to Israel. So the question is, Yehuda Kurtzer, would you be as embracing of rabbis in America who want to be present at intermarriages as you are asking the Orthodox rabbinate in Israel to be open to a certain kind of acceptance and embrace of styles which up till now they have felt in some way violate Jewish law?
Okay, so first I'm going to challenge your question, then I'll answer it.
Okay.
The challenge to your question is, I don't think they're the same. I don't think the same to say a Reform rabbi in Israel performing a marriage between two Jews can be analogized to a Reform rabbi in America performing an intermarriage. I think they're separate issues, and I think it does no favors to liberal Jews in Israel to qualify it that way. It actually fundamentally, I don't think this is what you're trying to do, but it fundamentally delegitimates their standing as Jews. And I think that's why I want to think of them differently. On the substance of the question of what do we do about this reality in America, it may surprise you. I don't think we have come up yet with a really credible argument for trying to hold on to clear boundaries between the Jew and the non-Jew in America as the incentive to hold on to public policies of they can't come into our communities and we can't facilitate it. I don't see it. I see colleagues like Jack Wertheimer and others who have tried to make an argument that what we should do is hold the line.
Yes, Jack Wertheimer is arguing that rabbis should never participate.
Not only should they not do it, they should educate against it.
Right.
They should work.
No intermarriages.
No intermarriage. And the problem, he blames, among other things, he blames the rabbis and says because they've capitulated, people think that it's okay. I think, to me, that what that does is it misreads what intermarriage is, which is the gift of the American steamroller. America hit Judaism and said, we want you to be part of us. We're not scared of your women anymore. We want to marry you. It's a social commodity. And so if we make Judaism an act of cultural resistance to this Americanness, we're going to be smaller and smaller. Now, if we were willing to say, that's okay. Like an act of intermarriage is an act of departure, and will be willing to be a smaller, tighter-knit community. At least that's honest, right? Maybe we have to shrink in order to survive. But I am much more sympathetic to the rabbis who say, look, what am I supposed to do? Joe is a congregant. His fiance wants to be involved in Jewish life. They're willing to raise their children Jewish. I find myself pulled much more to the side that says, what resources do we give those rabbis in those moments to be educators and to say to people, look, whether or not I'm willing to marry you, let me tell you what I'm struggling with. What I'm struggling with is, I think it takes 2 adult Jews to create a Jewish household. I can marry you. It's not an issue of the ritual, but I want to invest in you as Jews who are going to bring the next generation of Jewish life, to coach people towards conversion, right? To enable them to manage that process, not out of a sense of fear, if I don't do it, he's going to go to a different congregation, or fear of I'm going to be judged, but to really enable people to manage that conversation towards the outcomes that we want.
I want to make sure I hear you correctly. Yehuda Kurtzer, you would not be critical of a rabbi who took the position. It's important that 2 people create a Jewish home, and the best way to do that is if both people are embracing Judaism. And if I have a sense that the person who is not Jewish at the moment is really committed to a process and committed to the notion of a home that will create Jewish children and be part of the Jewish community, Yehuda Kurtzer would not be critical of a rabbi who stood at that chuppah or that wedding ceremony as a rabbi. You would not be critical.
Nor would I be envious. Right.
That's not your style to be envious. But
no,
you
but
wouldn't be,
like,
but critical is important for you to say. Because at the moment, you know, many Jews, many rabbis, I'm sure you're going to be surprising people by taking the stand you're taking. There are many rabbis, by the way, who say they'll marry any 2 people. But there are many rabbis who say, I am pained by my inability to stand with people I love.
Great. I'm also not critical of that stance.
You're not critical.
What I don't think right now with American rabbis who are, you know, just amazing servants on behalf of the Jewish people and who are getting beaten up on all sides.
Yes.
I don't feel that personally or institutionally, what I want to do is be critical of rabbis in those choices. I feel like they are, for most American Jews, still the gatekeepers of Judaism. I feel that my responsibility is to figure out, if that's the questions that they're asking, what resources do we have to provide for them? And what choices they make at the other end. That's why I say I'm not envious, because I'm not envious of the difficult position that they're in.
Okay. If one were here who disagreed with you, they would say the following to you. If rabbis participate in intermarriages, they're facilitating the dissolution of the Jewish people. That if you look at the numbers, just the numbers seem to indicate that the overwhelming number of grandchildren, of children of intermarried families, is like 8% Jewish. That ultimately, although people mean well, and to ask somebody who is not yet a parent, they're not even married.
Yeah.
They don't know what marriage is. They don't know what being a parent is. They don't know what it means all of a sudden to feel what they feel when they have this child. It's an unreasonable, it's almost an unfair thing to ask any non-Jew to promise. If you promise you'll bring your home set up to you, then I'll marry you. But that what you're suggesting is a way in which the Jewish community will be ensuring, it's Wertheimer's argument, that ultimately there won't be a Jewish community. And though it's true that we want to be as embracing as possible, and it's interesting, very few congregations now, especially within the Orthodox and conservative movements, reject anybody who is a non-Jewish spouse of a Jewish family that wants to be part of their congregation. We may not, rabbis say, we may not marry you, but if you get married somehow, then you're welcome in our synagogue. Yeah. And there's something that doesn't fit there. But that there are people who would argue with you that as lovely as what you say sounds, it is a recipe for the destruction of American Jewish life. And how would you answer them?
First of all, one thing I would say is, do you have any illusion that saying no to this couple is going to result in them deciding to call off their wedding?
Obviously
it's frivolous.
Not. That's silly.
But that's the point.
Silly.
You're a gatekeeper. You're at a moment, an inflection point in this person's Jewish life and their Jewish choices. If you say no, and I respect the integrity of somebody who says no, they will either find a rabbi who will say yes, or they will say Judaism is not for us. Now, have you changed the demographic numbers as a result? No. The point is, this is a runaway train, right? So what do we say as the gatekeepers and as the community? I think I'll draw a rough generalization. I think most of the people who intermarry in America, there are some Jews who intermarry with a profound and deep, thick sense of their own Jewishness, and they feel that it's okay to be a serious Jew married to a non-Jew. That's a small percentage, I say probably in major urban areas. Most of the American Jews who intermarry do so because they don't perceive a meaningful difference between being Jewish and being not Jewish. So that's our work. You want to stave off the decline of the Jewish community in America? Why are we not making a more persuasive case of the quality of Jewish life? That there's a real story to be told for Jews today, that something rich comes with being a proud member of the Jewish people. To the point where it becomes obvious or intuitive that if I want to be part of this people, and I want to perpetuate this people because it's worth perpetuating, that the best way for me to do that is to identify a partner who shares my values and wants to build a household with me together.
Yes, although you said it already, once you're in love, you're in love.
Okay, but then, so when do you position those choices is a big conversation that the community obviously has made enormous investments in with Birthright Israel and other types of programs where, and Birthright Israel was designed around intermarriage. It wasn't about Israel, it was about intermarriage. If we're the community has already said, let's position our 18 to 22-year-olds to try to influence those choices, because they will feel a part of the Jewish people, whether they will, whether they won't, I'm not sure. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's a single strategy. Mm-hmm. I think almost everything we do educationally is not motivated by intermarriage, but it's about the thickness and quality and depth of Jewish life today. And if people feel that being in Judaism and in Jewishness comes with something valuable, then they will opt to continue. And if they feel that it is fungible, then they won't opt to continue.
Okay. I'm in this awkward position where I am not indicating necessarily where I stand on this.
Yeah,
and obviously, okay. I've created a television channel which is non-Orthodox, it's not conservative, it's not Reform, it's not aligned with any branch of Judaism. The whole philosophy here is that we embrace as all expressions of Jewish life, and we also embrace a wide array of opinion about how the state of Israel should deal with its issues. Yeah. The one thing we don't say is we always are from the context that there should be an Israel and it should be a Jewish state. Yeah. But then people have from the left to the right. And at the same time, and now that one more thing for you, I've devoted my life to trying to excite people about who are not in the Orthodox world to what this extraordinary Jewish tradition is about. And then I come up against Pew. And what Pew seems to say to me is that although I am committed to this intellectually and emotionally, and I've given a life to this, created Shalom TV based on this, love what the Shalom Hartman Institute is the principles that were there, and we have the Shalom Hartman series every week on Shalom TV. I worry that Jewish pluralism has failed for the American Jewish future. And that what Pew seems to be saying is that if you look at who is involved most in support for the state of Israel, in Jewish philanthropy, in commitment to Jewish education, in commitment to the Jewish future, where you see this most is in homes where A, two Jews have married each other, and B, where they're involved in an enormous amount of Jewish ritual, what the average Jew would call an Orthodox home. It's not that simple, but there does seem to be a correlation between Jews who have a kosher home, who are Shomer Shabbat, or for whom Shabbat is sacrosanct in their life, and who send their kids to Jewish day schools and Jewish education. It seems like those Jews are so much more involved in and committed to and active in Jewish life, that the Jewish future here in this country is dependent upon that form of lifestyle. And so while I gravitate to everything you're saying, I also want you to speak to what seems to be the one glaring red light, and the red light seems to be that when you look at the overall sociological demographic of the American Jewish community, it doesn't seem to be working. Speak to me about that.
So a couple of things. First, the study, one of the best numbers in the study was that a higher percentage of Jews and respondents to the survey believe that God gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people than believe in God.
Yes, isn't that?
So there's something wrong with something wrong with something wrong with the numbers,
right?
So once we acknowledge something's wrong with the numbers, then we think of this as not a quantitative issue; it's a qualitative issue. When you say to me, pluralism has failed, and therefore let's look at the other places, I say to you, if that's the story, I'm out of here. Meaning, I don't want to say. The idea is horrifying to me.
Yes.
That we would say, what works is fundamentalism, and it's true. Fundamentalism works. Fundamentalism breeds an ideology that makes you have a lot of babies and be devoted to a cause and loyal to it. And I'm not talking about our religion. I'm talking about all sorts of religions in the world. Fundamentalism works at perpetuating itself until it creates cataclysm or until the bottom falls out. We're not that people. We're an aspirational people. We're never meant to be a people who just said, our whole purpose is to have Jewish babies. There's no voice to that effect in our tradition. Our tradition was about, we have a mission and a role as people in this world to do something, to be loyal to a tradition, to perpetuate it, to contribute to the world, to live out our destiny as a people. And this is the big idea that comes out of Pew for me. History is not destiny. The Pew tells you what are the formative ideas that have worked and not worked in shaping the current status of the American Jewish community. It does not predict for us where the Jewish community is going to be in 25 years, nor does it tell us nor do we learn from it what's working. What we see in it, this is a snapshot. If you said any time over the past 200 years, predict for me 25 years, 50 years from now what Jewishness was going to be, you would be wrong. In 1925, would you have been able to predict what Jewishness would be in 1950? It's a ludicrous proposition. What Pew does do for us is say, here's the work. If you want to make a case for a sustainable, transmittable Judaism that's outside the context of Orthodoxy, but with a loyalty to the values that are non-Orthodox values around pluralism and multivocality and all these pieces, you have work to do. So I see myself challenged by Pew, but not in the sense of your form of Judaism is wrong. I see myself challenged by Pew of like, okay, get to work.
That's fabulous, Yehuda. Okay, I want to ask you to comment on certain things that I've said. Oh, if I ever get to sit with Yehuda Kurtzer, I want to ask him.
Great.
You know that one of David Hartman's last books was From Defender to Critic.
Yeah.
I want you to speak about what that means to you. I didn't ask you, and I should ask you. To what extent do you feel in some way that you are now carrying the Hartman tradition on?
Yeah.
And to what extent do you work for Hartman, but you feel that as much as you respect whatever David Hartman stood for, it is just like the conservative movement is an institution, and you've said to me, institutions are not where you are. Are you bound by his orientation? So in some way, and I should tell you, one of the things that we did on Shalom TV over and over again, there was the Hartman Symposium, the Day of Symposium, and you were a major figure there. And I thought some of the sessions you did were outstanding. I played them over and over again. And I kept thinking to myself, I wanted to talk to you about some of the things I heard you say there. But I first should ask you to sort of give your sense of where you are vis-a-vis Hartman, and then I can ask you to what extent does his own journey, which went from defender to critic, to what extent does that resonate for you? But first, place yourself vis-a-vis David Hartman.
So it's really interesting. The Institute is now 35 years on, and it's very much an ideological place in the sense that there's a certain type of conversation that has taken place there, a certain set of ideas.
It evolved too, by the way.
Considerably.
Okay.
Yes, including going from being officially an Orthodox institution to a pluralistic one.
Right.
And for a long time, I think the Institute prided itself on a kind of approach towards talent development, which was hang around for 10 years and eventually you can teach, because it means you've immersed yourself in this culture. I only stepped foot for the first time at Hartman once I was interviewing for this job. It just never, for whatever reason, I never went through that pipeline.
You were at Wexner.
I was a Wexner Fellow during graduate school. I did a doctorate in Jewish Studies. I was teaching in the Hebrew College Rabbinical School. I got the job at Brandeis. I started a minyan, and then I was looking for a job.
But you hadn't yet been in the Hartman arena.
No, they pulled me in for a small project, but it wasn't anything significant, and I'd never been to the actual institute. And I think I and a few other people in the last number of years, as the Institute has evolved from being a place where you go to a place that's pushing out of its own walls, we've been kind of a test case for, is this ideology learnable, transmittable, and embodiable by people who are not of the fabric? And I think the answer has been yes. And I think for an institution to grow, it has to be yes. You know, you can't simply be that kind of incubator long term, because everything changes so fast, and you need a kind of different type of adaptability. It's also been an interesting institutional question for me for the last few years as we've created Hartman North America, because we have to bring on new people, and we have to on-ramp them and train them. And you want great teachers, but you also want people who are simpatico with this Hartman approach. And so learning how to teach it has been a big part of my job for the last few years. Mm-hmm. At this point, I feel, partly because this has worked out really well, and also because I've been able to become a shaper of the overall institute, that I don't see a huge gap in my own Jewish identity and thinking and the Institute's identity and thinking.
Yes, as I hear you talk, I don't hear it either. I think it's very consistent with where the institution has evolved into.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, one of the David Hartman's great bits was the difference between the yeshiva and the academy, is that in the academy you work really hard to find something to say that nobody said before. And the merit in the yeshiva, your goal is to say things that people said before, so that you can say, Baruch shekivanti, blessed am I that I said the same thing that Rashi said. And I've actually found, as I've been reading David Hartman since I started this work, there's so many of the things that I read and I just agree with.
Yes.
Implicitly. It's common sense. And I read it and I say, Baruch shekivanti. You know, I feel lucky to feel so aligned with what I think is the most creative Jewish philosopher of the second half of the 20th century.
All right. Now I come to from defender to critic. Yeah. And I was very lucky myself, because I've been doing this for a long time, and one of the individuals who helped shape my early work was David Hartman. And we have a fabulous interview that I did with him. I'm not the fabulous, I just listened to this. And it was in 1990, 91. That's many years ago already. And he was just out of this world, and I understood so much of what his Jewish perspective was, and how absolutely opposed he was to any kind of Jewish fundamentalism.
Yeah.
At the time, he was an Orthodox rabbi, and over time, that changed.
Yeah.
And when he wrote his book, Defender to Critic, which I understood completely, I also said to myself, oh, David Hartman's not an Orthodox Jew anymore. It's not simply that he was a critic of certain aspects of halakha and its lack of egalitarianism, and how he felt it did not deal appropriately with issues from agunot to tefillah, but that ideologically he was no longer an Orthodox Jew. And when I referred to you in the Hartman Symposium that you were part of here in New York, at one point, it's in a session Daniel is having with Arnie Eisen, and there's a question from the audience. And the questioner basically said that to both Arnie and to Daniel. This isn't orthodoxy anymore. And I felt that the answer should have been, yes, it isn't. And that was not quite the answer that was given. I want to know from your perspective, as you see, again, I'm using defender to critic symbolically, the journey that David took, the journey that the Hartman Institute takes, and in some place it reflects where you are. Talk about the extent to which Hartman went from defender to critic, and how and whether in essence, and I'm doing it harshly now, Yehuda, in some way for some people it invalidates not the style of living of Orthodoxy, but the fundamentalist attitude that is really at the essence of a certain kind of Orthodoxy. You know, respond any way you wish.
Look, I'll give you first an institutional answer, which is there are definitely people out there who I think for problematic reasons, were always drawn to the Institute because it was a bunch of Orthodox Jews talking a language that was appealing to them as non-Orthodox Jews. I think the Institute benefited for many years from Reform and conservative rabbis like studying with liberal Orthodox Jews. And we don't have that anymore. and I don't want to peddle that. I want to be evaluated on the merits of who we are, and not on style points. And it's a piece of the business that suffers, because one of the things that happens with that is once you let go of also the Orthodox label, you're less likely to attract Orthodox audiences, and I think that's a loss for the Institute, and I think it's, and frankly, I'll say with some hubris, I think it's a loss for Orthodoxy. I guess, to me, the way I understand that journey of David Hartman, and I only really met David very late in his life. I think the way he tried to position his story was less in From Defender to Critic, which was a collection of stuff, and more in The God Who Hates Lies, which was his penultimate book.
Again, fabulous.
Which I love that. I love that book.
Fabulous. Everybody should pick it up. The God Who Hates Lies.
I think David tried to tell his story as not a journey from Orthodox rabbi to skeptic. I think he tried to tell a story of a person in lifetime quest for honesty. That there's a point in his life when, and I don't say this about the Orthodox world in general. Some of my best friends are Orthodox rabbis, but yes, there can be a certain approach that says, I'm not going to address that set of questions because I don't have good answers for it. I'm not going to open that door, or I will open a certain door intellectually and shut it quickly if it doesn't find my satisfactory answer. And I think what The God Who Hates Lies reflected to me was a willingness to say, I'm opening a set of doors on questions that I don't have great answers to, and I'm going to just finally say what I think about them. And I'm going to feel less constrained by the politics of what I'm allowed to say and not allowed to say. Now, you can do that when you found your own institute with your name on it. I get it. He wasn't an Orthodox rabbi anymore in any sense other than the way he was ordained. So I know that there's a freedom to that and a luxury that comes with that freedom. But I think that there's something highly adaptable as a methodology that we need to hold on to as an institute, which is a kind of chronic obsession with honesty. If you're teaching a class and it's nice, it's a nice reading of a text, but it's not accurate, nonsense. Good, the Torah that we teach should always be, something that could stand up credibly to intellectual scrutiny, and nice and useful, and the kind of stuff that could actually help catalyze Jewish life. And they can't be one or the other. And I think that was, to me, that story of David is much more interesting as a developmental story of a willingness to really stand with integrity about hard questions and sometimes be able to say, my tradition doesn't offer good answers to it, than it is about the denominational move from inside the camp to outside the camp.
Why isn't that simply what JTS has been trying to do since the 30s, 40s, 50s, and in the 50s and 60s, it was the preeminent institution of Jewish life. Why isn't that exactly what, and again, this is not about the conservative movement as an institution, but there was an ideology, there was a philosophy of the early conservative movement, and the grappling between the Heschels and the Kaplans was all about A, honesty, and B, saying, we love the Jewish tradition. At the same time, it's not always, as it's articulated in the more fundamentalist traditional sense, it's not always reflecting the truth that we believe our God stands for. And the reason I say JTS, which is a conservative rabbinical school, as opposed to simply non-orthodoxy, HUC. HUC-JAR, which I have enormous regard for, was not there. That was not the principle that Isaac Mayer Wise founded HUC and then HAC-JAR with Stephen Wise. That was not the principle. There are many now non-Orthodox Jews, be they conservative or reform, who embrace exactly what you're saying. But when I read The God Who Hates Lies and Defender to Critic, I said to myself, oh, what's the chidush here? I'm a little bit surprised that David Hartman is acting like he's creating something of a new philosophy.
But you skipped over the acknowledgments, because he says in the introduction to the book, I'm aware that some of my conservative reform colleagues may say to me, we've come to these conclusions before, and all I'm doing is telling you my story of how I've reached them. Right, and so that's why it's a story of honesty, and it's not a story of what's the what's the JTS or HUC position on this issue? Let me take it out and now acknowledge it.
Yes, but in essence, aren't you also saying that what Hartman ultimately evolved to is the essential message of non-Orthodox Judaism that is committed to a Jewish future?
I don't think it has to be that way. I think it's, and I see this because...
How is it different?
I see this because we have Orthodox scholars at Hartman who don't see themselves as engaging in a transgressive project. I don't think that that's what it needs to be. I think our project in general is a radically open confrontation with the world in all of its disciplines and methodologies and complexities and realities, and a radical commitment to Jewish learning sources and where we have found the context of our authenticity, and that those have to happen simultaneously and in constant dialogue with each other.
Yes, but
I need to be able to call, when the tradition tells me to speak in a voice that I find to be morally problematic, I need to be able to call shenanigans and just say, no, I can't allow that voice to be dominant. I'm allowed to use my moral instinct in this moment. And at other times, when the tradition tells me to do something that is morally okay, but I don't like, I need to be able to also call my own sensibilities and say, you know what, I'm commanded and I'm held by this. I don't think this is, again, it's not about institutions. Certainly JTS can't, I mean, I don't want this to be about that.
No, I don't either.
In fact, when Arnie Eisen, who for many years has taught at Hartman, when he took over as chancellor of the seminary, he said in his opening speech, I want JTS to be a hybrid of the Hebrew University and the Shalom Hartman Institute. So we're speaking the same language. And I think it's to the credit of David Hartman that Arnie was one of his students, that David Ellenson was one of his students, and that they went off and said, our responsibility is to a network of synagogues in this movement to do the same kind of work.
I don't want to be misunderstood here. I'm not arguing that at all. In essence, what I'm saying is Hartman and an essential principle that was underlying non-Orthodox Judaism, whether it was at JTS or later on at HUC, all are embracing the same approach to Judaism, as opposed to an Orthodox fundamentalism. And, you know, again...
Fine. In that case, I'm happy to accept non-Orthodox bedfellows in that regard. But I would also say there are plenty of modern Orthodox Jews who would equally reject that Orthodox fundamentalism, who certainly are welcome in our tent, and also might have stylistic reasons to not come to the Shalom Hartman Institute.
Yes.
But I think this is, to me, the more interesting story is not Hartman moving out of Orthodoxy and moving over here, but a general consensus, whether it's Orthodox Jews, Reform Jews, Conservative Jews, whoever, of do we want to be in this deep embrace and confrontation between what our tradition commands us to do and what the world commands us to do, or do we not? And maybe some slip over on one end because they are lazy and they don't want to feel pulled by this, and some slip on another end because they feel that it's dangerous territory to be in this confrontation. That, to me, is where the action is in that,
absolutely.
In that mix.
And the way you say it is what we hope not only rabbis, but any seriously committed Jew would want to engage in.
Exactly.
And you're trying to do that in your work, and in some way, the fact that I get to present you is my way of doing the same thing. I wanted you to talk to me for one moment about your sense of God. When I talked to David Hartman, it was a very midrashic view of God.
Yeah.
At the moment, we live in a strange time, Yehuda, and maybe you'll agree with me or not. I find we live in a very strange time when there almost is a craving for a return by many people to a supernatural, personalized supernatural view of what God is and what God does. And I'm trying to say that the Hartmans and those who come very much, many of those who studied with Soloveitchik, who was obviously a very Orthodox Jew, at the same time a very midrashic Jew, find that what you're talking about is a form of Jewish poetry, and that fundamentalism was never a Jewish style, is not a Talmudic style, and that if you find passages in the Talmud or in Jewish law or Jewish tradition which seem to be fundamentalist, if you do any kind of pushing on them, they always are really seen in a poetic context. And I want to know the extent to which this resonates for you too, And whether ever you are ever in a position where you're asked to talk to other Jews about God, and when you do that, to what extent is it how you do that in a way that you feel is both honest and comfortable for you?
So first of all, look, the brilliance of Jewish pluralism is that it's modeled in our tradition, right? You want to find any idea about God, anthropomorphic, anti-anthropomorphic, they're all in the Talmud, right? The rabbis are essentially working this out, and precisely because I think that they see themselves as at a moment in Jewish history, unlike the biblical period, when the whole premise of biblical theology was certainty. God is present in our midst. We can learn whether we're doing right or wrong, either through our kind of robot system with the stones on the breastplate of the high priest, or through rain in the land of Israel. We know how we're doing, and we change our behavior, and we have to work it out. The whole exilic diasporic experience is we're actually on our own, and we need to figure this out. And so a lot of Jewish literature around God is a theoretical exploration of how do I hold on to the importance of God in my life and yet not have the hubris to claim that God is directly commanding me to do X, Y, and Z. That to me is already a useful model for thinking about this in the present. I taught about God in our faith seminar in Jerusalem a couple summers ago. Maybe it has appeared on Shalom TV. If not, it will. And the one place I felt most comfortable speaking about this was as the faith conversation is inflected through public policy debates. And I spoke about what I called faith and ambivalence, and how what we as people of the tradition need to do, it was a very programmatic talk, what we as people of the tradition need to do is to take back the language of God as associated with certainty and move God conversation to a language of ambivalence. Ambivalence. And I'll give you two great examples of modern texts that do this, that are not of our own tradition, but are actually quite useful and very resonant with rabbinic sources. One is the stuff that was left on the cutting room floor from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, when he actually says, I don't know if we are right or wrong about what God wants us to do, but all we can do is marshal up the best that our moral instincts tells us about what God wants us to do in the world, and then go out and do it. And he was using God language to on one hand, inspire the people towards what he perceived as a moral political behavior, but he was willing to couch it in a kind of ambivalence about the direct line. I think that's an unbelievably important idea. And the same goes for Mario Cuomo's amazing talk in 1985, I think, at Notre Dame, in light of the controversy that had emerged around his own views on abortion and a conflict that emerged with him in the Catholic Church, where he also gets very personal and says, how have we created a culture around faith where my loyalty to God requires me to act in a particular political way in the world? How do we actually get to a place where loyalty to God actually makes me humble about what God wants me to do, and then requires me to take seriously the various moral and political intuitions that I have? That, to me, is a type of God talk that actually frees us from the fundamentalism and gets us closer to I think, the anxieties of the rabbis themselves. And
you're saying that really reflects your understanding of what the Jewish tradition is trying to teach us as well about God.
Yes. I think it does.
Oh, I love what you say. And yes, I believe ambivalence is the proper Jewish posture.
That's right, in general, yeah.
Yes, in general. Yeah. And there is humility very, very well done. Again, it goes back to something I said to you earlier. At any given time, I could say to you, what's the forefront of your consciousness? What's really consuming you at the moment? So whatever you say to me right now, if we do this some other time, you can answer it differently. I'm asking where you are today as you sit at this table. If somebody said to you, Yehuda Kurtzer, explain to me what it is about this Jewish thing, the Jewish tradition, the Jewish experience, the Jewish embrace of the world that excites you so much, that you hope Jews today understand more of. If there were one or two elements of it, what is for you the essential? It's not, again, give me on one foot, but what are some of the ideas, Yehuda, that you really you try to communicate whenever you speak to people, that you wish, if there was one or two things you had to understand, that makes this Jewish tradition so glorious? What are they for you?
You know, part of the reason I wanted to talk about the most important Jewish idea is because I want us to get back to a place where we think like Hillel and Shammai, that everything is about complexity all the time actually is not that inviting. It means it's smart, but it's not inviting. And what's amazing is that the rabbis, Hillel, Shammai, Rabbi Akiva, they actually were comfortable using the phrase, Klal Gadol BaTorah. This is an important principle of Torah. Or, this is the most important idea in Judaism, and then go do it. And actually, so let's take those two, right? So one is Hillel, who says, what is hateful to you, don't do unto your neighbor, right? His version of the golden rule, now go and learn, right? That to me is an unbelievable Jewish idea. Start with the primacy of Jewish ethics, right? How are you supposed to treat another human being? How do you see another human being created in the image of God? Once you're capable of doing that, you are in an ethical conversation, and now the second piece is equally important. You have a responsibility to now deepen it through an embrace of ideas and through learning. Right? Sometimes you jettison the second half of Hillel's statement of just be nice to other people, but he's actually saying the embrace of other people, Jewish ethics, how you treat the other, is the first step. That's how you get in, and then what your responsibility is to now investigate what that means. So that's one. I guess the other, and I wind up teaching this a lot, is the amazing rabbinic story about Moses being confused in the back of Rabbi Akiva's Beit Midrash, the great time machine story, that he gets fast-forwarded and can't follow what's going on in Rabbi Akiva's Beit Midrash, in his house of study. And he's confused and he's sad, because he was the great receiver of the Torah and the transmitter, and now he can't follow what it has become. And so what I'm moved by in this story is the empathy for one generation of Jews feeling as though they've lost because the next generation of Jews is not doing what they were doing. They can't recognize Judaism anymore. It's so familiar, right? What are the kids doing with Judaism these days that I can't recognize? But then Rabbi Akiva, to his credit, culminates that story by saying when his student says, where do you get this from? He says, it's a law that I learned from Moses at Sinai. In other words, he's willing to acknowledge that the source of wisdom and authority is well behind him. And what it winds up playing out is, and this is to me, again, I go back to this a lot, that we're in a great moment of a Jewish passage of time, one generation handing off to the next. It's always happening, but right now it feels like it's really happening. What would it be like to have a culture of both a radical willingness to let the next generation of Jewish life take this and do with it what it will, and a kind of humility by the next generation of Jewish life to acknowledge the gifts that it's gotten from its predecessor? Though you can't have one without the other, because one without the other is either the hubris of taking something and running with it and never crediting back what you've gotten to get there, and you can't just have the humility of the next generation, because then that doesn't come with a kind of creative energy that enables that next generation to do something really meaningful with it.
You're fabulous.
You too, Mark.
No,
Thank you.
You are fabulous. And I want to say to you, people have to, on the one hand, I don't mean to embarrass you, and you're not an arrogant person. It's just, it never comes, it's not who you are. And yet at the same time, you have to hear what an enormous contribution you're making, how you're shaping, you're shaping the ability of other Jews to embrace this Jewish thing in such a wonderful, wonderful way. And it's, I love you dearly, and the fact that you went out of your way to sit with me this long is wonderful. I won't let you go unless you promise to come back.
I'm happy to.
Okay.
Anytime.
And also, we spoke off camera for one moment. You have to finish the story for me.
Yeah.
You're married to Stephanie.
Yes.
What's she doing now?
She's the director for the New Israel Fund of the Tri-State area.
We have to have her at this table.
Yes.
Okay. How did you meet her?
Stephanie and I were introduced by a mutual friend at the Kotel.
At the Kotel?
On Yom Yerushalayim, the day of Jerusalem's reunification.
No. So you met the woman you ultimately married at the Western Wall.
I know. That's an extremely lame story.
It's a gorgeous story.
Yeah.
Everything you're doing, Yotzei Min HaKlal.
Thank you.
And I wish you kol tuv v'hatzlacha.
Thank you.
From strength to strength, we'll follow you and we'll learn from you, and you're always welcome here, always.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yehuda Kurtzer, president of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. If people want to reach out and be involved in any way with the Shalom Hartman Institute here in America, how do they reach you?
You can find us on the web at www.shalomhartman.org.
Okay. And are they able to do any kind of educational work with you?
Yes, we do programming around the country, oftentimes through local synagogues and through local Jewish institutions. We do a lot on the web, and we also have summer programs for both rabbis and lay leaders in Jerusalem.
Wonderful. Yehuda Kurtzer, president of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. I hope you enjoyed meeting him and hearing his perspective on Jewish life today as much as I have. Of course, as always, I'd love to hear any thoughts you have to the ideas expressed by Yehuda Kurtzer. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. It means so much to me to hear from you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. LChayim, my friends, to life.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.
LChayim is a presentation of Jewish Education in Media.